Well, hi, everyone. This is Daniel Williams, host of the MGMA Podcast Network. I'm excited about this guest we have today. It's Scott Becker. You may know that name if you have anything to do with healthcare because you probably receive the Becker's newsletters, Becker's podcast. Scott Becker is everywhere in healthcare. And so, Scott, I just want to welcome you to the show.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for having me. We're a huge fan and we followed the MGMA forever, it feels like. And so it's just a pleasure to be here. And thank you very, very much for having me.
Yeah, it really is. It's kind of neat because we're in some of the same spaces. We cover some of the same material. We're educating a lot of those same healthcare professionals out there. So when I was looking into your background, I did not realize you got your training as an attorney. First, talk about law school. What was that like going through law school? And then when did you decide to make that move into healthcare or to specialize in healthcare law?
Sure. So those are great questions. Like so many things in life, there's a mix of sort of goals and plans, and then at periods of time where you sort of start to feel a direction or see a direction and you start to pursue that direction. So I would say like I was very simply, I would say accidental lawyer, accidental media person. And I'll tell you both those things. And I know this is a bit obnoxious, but because no one that's from Harvard doesn't say it within the first 5 minutes of a discussion, but I wasn't necessarily planning to go to law school. I took the LSATs, I took the GMATs. The GMATs were for business, the LSATs were for law. I did well on the LSATs, ended up getting into Harvard Law School, ended up going to Harvard Law School. And it was not like I had this lifelong desire to go back to my generation, to be Perry Mason or to be like a courtroom lawyer. I was a kid. I was 22. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but figured go to law school for a few years, go to Harvard Law School. It was never going to hurt to have gone to Harvard Law School, that would be a good sort of like starting point. But there was no sort of like clarity about this is what I want to do. This is where I want to be. It was more, seems like a good next step. And at that point, why not? Law school ended up being a fascinating experience just because you're around so many, more than anything else. The education's so much the same from law school to law school. And it's a lot of like in any business, any place you're in, it's a lot about the peer group that you're with. And there were just so many motivated, smart, intelligent, interesting people. I would describe it. I had a Big Ten experience, magnificent experience at University of Illinois. And at University of Illinois, I would say if I would describe different colleges, different environments, like at University of Illinois, we were back in the day, 18 to 22. People might go out 4 days a week. You knew when nickel beer night was. By law school, it's people that went out 1 to 2 nights a week. Okay. It's just a different world in terms of motivation, drive, energy, and it differs from college to college and place to place as well. But just the level of sort of, there's just a really lot of bright people that were very motivated. So as an example, and I know I'm not going to try and go too deep right this moment, but we had President Obama was in school when I was at school. He was a first year when I was a third year. And I got to be a moot court student advisor to a class he was in. So him and 10, 11 other students, 2 of the students were Barack Obama and this famous judge's son, Eric Posner. Okay. And so 2 of the 12 kids I was a third year, their first years, but the 2 of them, were just playing a different intellectual game than I was, just extremely gifted. Like President Obama and this kid, Eric Posner, who's now a professor at a law school, would explain to the class, I think this is what Scott's trying to say. And it wasn't, and they weren't condescending. They were right. Like I felt like I was on a Saturday Night Live skit, but they were playing a different intellectual game than I was. Just like they're just, and that's not fake humility. That's just true. Mm-hmm. Just very gifted and very nice. So there's those kinds of experiences that we had in law school. They just can't have it very many places. And there's a decent amount of those kinds of experiences. They're just around people that are like gifted, driven people. And there's a lot of them, at Harvard Law School. Then I ended up in the sort of the law practice at a large firm for my first few years. And the law practice is a whole mess of different things. I'm still at a law firm 30 years later. I've been at the same law firm now for 30 years. The first one, I was still, again, a kid, 25 to 28, and didn't know what I wanted to do other than I wanted to have a job and be able to support myself. And then at some point, we're starting to figure that out. And Becker's Healthcare really started back, it's now 30 something years ago. We're in our 30th annual ASC conference this year. Man, it would be 32 or 33, but for COVID,
Right.
But it's, it started like 30 years ago, my late 20s. It really, because I was trying to figure some things out versus necessarily trying to build a media company.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't at that point trying to build a law firm. I was trying to build a media company, but as one of the great lessons I have for my children, for others that I talk to is, when you start to feel passion towards things, you have to lean into those things, because those are the things that take you where you want to go. There's periods of life where those passions come naturally. There's periods of life where, my God, you have to cultivate them. They're hard to find. You're not as excited about your current goals. You're not excited about what you're currently doing. All of us go through those. And periodically, when you see things that are interesting to you, you have to cultivate those interests. And at some point, we cultivate that interest in ultimately building a media company. That wasn't the real purpose to begin with, and ultimately building, law practice. And again, but they grew on me, and I was smart enough as they grew on me to double down on them and gain more and more interest in them, and ultimately, loved both those things.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question then, because I know that you had to have put a lot of hard work into making all of these different things happen. I mean, you say, well, I didn't really think about going to law school, but I got into Harvard Law School, and then I wasn't really dreaming about building a media company, but you did it and it worked. And are you lucky, or are you just really, what did you see in healthcare media that there was a gap, or there was an opening where Scott Becker could jump into that and make it work?
Yeah, I think there's so many different pieces to that. It's anybody that has had serious success knows there's at least a couple different pieces to it. There's a great author that says at some point in your life, you have to put in a seriously focused 10 years to build anything serious. And it's not too different than people talking about the 10,000 hour rule or all those kind of things. But at some point in your life, to get good at something, you have to put some serious time into it. And that's the part of it that's good and drive and motivate and those things. The second part of it is, if you're tuned in enough, periodically you're hopeful to have some luck and come into the right areas. Like, I was not a deeply analytical person in terms of like, I should choose this business versus this versus this business. What I was far better at is, when I see things going well, doubling and tripling down my energy on those things. And so we ended up in the media business. Originally, we were competing with a magnificent publication that's still a magnificent publication, and they were all a print publication.
Okay.
And I self-funded. When you self-fund, I had editorial people that were like, we have to put out 60,000 magazines a week like they do, and you're in the publishing business through MGMA and so forth. You realize if you're self-funding and you don't grow up with a fortune, you can't do that. You just can't do that. You just can't afford it. We would have gone broke in 3 weeks at most. I don't know how, but a very short period of time. So we ended up, the good thing about when you're totally tuned in, you pay attention enough. And for most of us, we go through different periods of life, where you're tuned in or not so tuned in. And I think it's, there are people that are just beasts that can do it all the time. Most of us, you go through periods of time where you're really tuned in, you're really on your game, and times you're not. So at one point here, it goes back 20 or 30 years ago, we made a very clear decision. We can't win against them in print, but we were at the beginning of the digital landscape for all kinds of business. Right. And we said, well, what we'll try and do is beat them on the web and digitally, which was a completely different game that others weren't focused on. And they made so much money through print, they weren't really interested in moving towards digital. And so the luck was, we're able to double and triple down on quadruple on digital. And I remember the first month that me and my partner, who's our CEO, has been with me forever, Jessica Cole, he had won the sort of sweeps in having more digital visitors than they did. But the decision was, double down on digital versus on print because we couldn't win on print. So were we good? We were smart enough to double down what was working. And then we were lucky because we were at the beginning of the digital landscape, digital information world, to build a digital property today. And we've studied this because we've studied a lot of different companies that have built it today. It's a massively expensive for most of them because they're paying to be in front of Yahoo Finance. They're paying to be in front of other audiences that somebody's already developed. It's a very different game. So we were good enough, but we were also very smart and lucky at understanding we can't compete in that.
Right.
We can compete in this, and knowing we just couldn't win in that. We always talk about in businesses, can you win in it and is it worth winning in? Mm-hmm. Two different things. And, there's a lot of different philosophies in this. We're a big believer. I've got multiple different podcasts. One of them, I know it's very hard to win in because it's a general business podcast.
Okay.
It's very hard to win in that. I mean, it's great. I enjoy it tremendously, but it's like you're competing against everybody in it.
Right.
And it's more of an advanced hobby than a business because it's just so hard to win in. Whereas if you're in a niche, it's easier to win. And then can you win and is it worth winning in? Is how we sort of look at a lot of these things. But it's a lot of like, you have to be, like we tell entrepreneurs, you better be passionate. You better build great teams and you better find niches, and that's really the key to entrepreneurship. But you better be motivated, you better build great teams, and you better find niches, and you treat your people and your customers well. We call it customer centric, niche centric, team centric, those three things we talk about constantly.
Okay. Now, you said you didn't plan to go to law school. You didn't plan to start a media company. When you were a kid, did you grow up in Chicago? I know you're in Chicago now. Where'd you grow up?
Yes. I grew up in Skokie, which is just the suburb of Chicago, which was a fascinating period of time. We grew up in an area that had per capita more Holocaust survivors than any other place,
right?
And where the Nazis would come to periodically march to try and the neo-Nazis to try and sort of irritate the Holocaust survivors.
Right.
It was a period of time of lots of the parents were very big on education, were very big. There was a lot of, if you live in a post-Holocaust community, and this goes back a long time, people can't even understand anymore. You grew up in a community where there's a lot of paranoia, there's a lot of nervousness, there's a lot of nervous energy. There's a lot of those qualities because you're living with 10-15% of the community actually had spent time in a Holocaust concentration camp. So it was at one time the largest concentration of Holocaust survivors, which leads to a community where people have a lot of nervous energy and a lot of those things. And I probably am a victim or beneficiary or victim of that upbringing.
Right. Well, a couple of years ago, I saw a documentary film. You've probably seen that depicts that community there of Holocaust survivors and those neo-Nazis marching down the street. And then they showed the legal proceedings of them getting the right to be able to march down the street. Have you seen that documentary?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And in fact, yes, it's yes. And it was a fascinating period of time. It was fascinating versus scary. It wasn't you grew up at a different time. There was so many of those things that you just don't even we had a cross burned on our lawn at one time as a kid. We didn't even but it would have been scarier in other places. It wasn't particularly scary for us. It was just part of upbringing and interesting. It was fascinating, but it leads to a decent amount of nervous energy and drive probably.
For sure. So when you were growing up in that community and you weren't thinking about law school and you weren't thinking about a media company, what did you dream about? Were you going to play shortstop for the Cubs or tight end for the Bears? I mean, what were you thinking about doing as an adult?
It's so funny. So all of us at some point, think about different things like that. All of us at some point, I'm a very average athlete. Every average athlete wants to be a pro sport,
right.
Pro athlete at some point. I read a book at one time about playing football, and it basically said if you're slow and small, it's probably not the right sport to make your living in. And so this was actually like, as I loved like all my sports, I loved playing everything. I was very average at everything. I loved it. But like, once I read, well, if you're slow and small, you probably shouldn't plan on making a living at this.
Yeah.
Then I figured I better figure out how to make a living. In the community I grew up in, it's much like other immigrant communities today. The choices were you're allowed to be a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant. Those are your three choices, and you could do whatever you want as long as it's one of those three. And so we ended up, and this was back in the day. Our kids today have so many different choices. The parents aren't nearly as rigorous about telling the kids what to do, but so we ended up going to undergraduate in business, accounting, and finance, and ended up going to law school, and at least, made my parents happy for the time being, and then went from there.
Okay. Is Chicago-style pizza, should it be called pizza, or is it more like pie? I mean, I've had a piece of it, and I'm so full, I can't even imagine having a second piece. So what you tell us.
So this is a great question. There's multiple different pizza places in Chicago. This is a great question. So there's the deep dish, like Giordano's is now in Colorado off of the 16th Street Mall over that way after the promenade, whatever. And that's truly deep dish pizza. Yeah. There's plenty of that. Then there's thinner crust, like Barnaby's or Pequod's has both. Lou Malnati's has both. It just depends on what you prefer. But it's not like it's not like it's the downside is it's no good for weight control. The good thing is it tastes good. There's all kinds of different varieties.
Right.
But pizza is one of those foods like pizza, like tacos, like lots of food.
Right.
It's hard to make a bad pizza. It's hard to make a bad taco. There's certain kinds of food, and you see why they're so prevalent because it's hard to do it poorly. Yeah. It's like you could make bad pizza and it's still pretty good generally. Right. You can make bad tacos and they're still pretty good.
For sure. Well, thank you for taking us down that track.
My pleasure.
Scott, we've talked a little bit about sports. Chicago is a legendary sports town. I'm in Denver. There's fanatical Broncos fans. They're more with the other sports here. They might be a little more bandwagony because we've got a lot of Nuggets fans because they're good right now. But what about in Chicago? Would you grow up just being so passionate about that you would cry when the team lost? Who'd you follow like that?
So yeah. So we're a Chicago sports fan all the way through. I remember crying when the Black Sox lost in the Stanley Cup to the Montreal Canadiens. This goes back probably to the early 70s. But literally, remember, you asked me when I cried. It was then.
Yeah.
We were here in Chicago through the Bulls having just magnificent seasons with Michael Jordan and all that. We're lifelong Bears fans, and that goes back and forth. Hopefully, we're on the uptick again. We love the Blackhawks. They're sort of okay right now. The Cubs are playing well. The White Sox, we're not as big a fan of, but we like the White Sox. But they're struggling right now.
Yeah. Did you know the Super Bowl shuffle back in '85 when the Bears had that great team?
100%. I mean, we're all, you could do it, the punky QB, which was Jim McMahon in the Super Bowl shuffle. I mean, if you grew up in Chicago and you're a sports fan, you just loved every minute of that. Right. It was the shortest lived dynasty ever. They won one season, but it was, it was unbelievable. And then it sort of fell apart very quickly. They had the falling out between sort of Ditka and Buddy Ryan, the coach and the defensive coordinator. And it just sort of went south. I mean, in a hurry, but it was, it's unusual. Once in a while you get a team that's dominant and it's fun.
For sure. Yeah. I grew up in Mississippi. And so one of our favorite sons, Walter Payton, was your running back for so long. He was so much fun to watch, just a remarkable athlete. What'd you think about Sweetness?
Yeah. So Walter was a Jackson State guy from Mississippi, and he was beloved. I mean, he was beloved, and he was he was one of those players that just grinded it out. He was phenomenal to watch. He had a great attitude, great work ethic. He had a Jerry Rice type work ethic. He sadly died young of a liver type of disease or something. It's very sad, but was he was phenomenal, and he's also an indication. All those great running backs
of how the game has changed so much. Because like today it's all built, I know we're off the healthcare subject, but today it's so built around receivers and tight ends versus running backs. Running backs are just, it's like, it's an amazing change because we're really back to how important that was. And the Bears got great when they were able to combine the passing game with the running game, and then had a great defense too. But no, Walter was loved here, was just really like a beloved figure in Chicago.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking us down memory lane. I can tell that you and I could talk sports for a long time, but just we'll reel it back to healthcare. But I've experienced Becker's, whether it's Becker's Hospital Review, Becker's Healthcare, or all of your various podcasts for so long. And it's sometimes it's good to know the person behind all of that. So it was good to share that because I'm sure lots of people who have consumed all of those media platforms of yours had no idea of all these other interests that you may have. So thanks for sharing that with us. So let's talk first about those media platforms. You talked about how you saw that opportunity in the digital platforms, but go a little bit beyond that. I mean, where did your passion for healthcare come from? And I guess tell us what your goal was. I mean, obviously have a successful business, but beyond just that, what did you envision in constructing those media platforms?
Yeah. So one of my sort of pluses and negatives is I'm very much incrementalist versus like the difference in law school. There were certain people that were so bright, they could see 8 drafts ahead. Others of us are more blockers and tacklers and what I would call incrementalists. So when I first got started, we started in healthcare with a very small newsletter. I was trying to develop a reputation as really a thought leader more than anything else. It wasn't trying to turn it into commercial property. And we started sort of doing, and I was enjoying it. I like to interact with people. I love the area. I find it fascinating. I'm a big believer in that you can't be an expert in everything, so you better be an expert in a couple things. And my niches were in healthcare and within a couple areas of healthcare. And so as it became more interesting to me, it was like a building passion or a cultivating passion. We started to do this, and we started to do a conference, and we started to do more newsletters. And then at some point, 5 to 10 years into it, I started to hire people. And when I started to hire people, and that was when we started to get more serious about what are we trying to do. And so I hired a number of people. One of them that I hired was a friend's niece who had been a University of Iowa graduate, Jessica Cole. Jessica's the CEO and partner and president. She really runs the company today. Really just an unusually intelligent, people-centric, gifted leader. And it was that sort of combination of the two of us with a lot of other people that allowed us to really start to grow it into something serious. So, you could almost look at it as before Jess and after Jess. Once Jessica joined it, we got much more serious about planning and going and doing what we're doing and developing a company, developing a team and stuff like that. And, now we have 100 plus employees and team members that are fantastic. We've got a number of leaders that have been with us for 10, 15 years that are fantastic. The CEO, the COO, Katie Atwood, the leaders of our editorial team, the chief of staff, Annie Stokes, many of them have been with us for 10, 15 years, and they've built just a great culture and a great company. But we sort of incrementally got more and more serious about it. And the big first step was building Jess and building teams. I do a lot of one-off things. All of my one-off things suffer from not having the same talent and team that we either built at the law firm or built at Becker's Healthcare. Like you just can't do things of the quality you want without ultimately having teams and great colleagues with you. And so, we do a lot of one-off things that I enjoy tremendously that I don't want to invest and build a team around. But ultimately, those things can't thrive and be nearly as high quality as the things I do with teams, because you need other leaders and people that can just make things a different level of professional.
Right. Moving to that next platform, this is one version of it, a podcast. What did you see in this media platform that you said, I got to get into that. And then, wow, you've had extraordinary success in the podcast field as well.
Yeah. So we generally, almost everything we do in a somewhat similar way. We sort of, we first started doing some podcast and testing it and doing different things with it, and I would say, I mean, I could tell you because I look at stats all the time on our podcast. The first month of doing real podcast, we had 143 downloads, 143 total downloads.
Right.
And that's a relatively to extremely small number of total downloads. But it was really like when I first built a legal practice, the first year of building a legal practice, we brought in $7,000. And what happens is when you have sort of like that first touch of something, you then have to figure out, are you finding it interesting? Are you going to cultivate your passion in it, or are you going to give up? Mm-hmm. And there's certain things I certainly should have given up on in life. Other things I ended up doubling and tripling down on. Yeah. The podcast thing is fascinating. It's the podcast thing I enjoyed tremendously because I love visiting with people, and doing it, in this manner makes it just so efficient. So I enjoyed it tremendously. If not for COVID, I probably would have given it up a long time ago. Once COVID hit, our healthcare podcast grew tremendously. Went from, literally whatever amount of downloads to all of a sudden doing 300,000 downloads a month, whatever amount of downloads a month, but a whole different thing. It took a long time to cultivate that. And it was a great mix of doing lots of guest episodes, like a tremendous amount of guest episodes. Most of our episodes are 15 minutes. Like a day like tomorrow, I'll record 7 different episodes. So it's a lot of them. I enjoy it tremendously. I like having a book schedule versus not. But I probably I enjoyed it. We put a toe in the water. And then at some point, it caught my interest. It sort of caught my interest. And we doubled and tripled down on it. Now, of course, at Becker's Healthcare, I do a lot of episodes, but a lot of other people do the episodes too. So It's not just me. I have a separate podcast around business and private equity that I do that's more just me talking about different business subjects. And I enjoy it tremendously as well. But it's like a lot of things. Like we dabbled in it. And at some point you figure out, are you enjoying it? What parts of it do you enjoy? And can I do more of the parts that I really enjoy and that have a connection with people?
Yeah. So I have to ask this question because at MGMA, we just put out a recent survey for our MGMA members. We asked them, has their stress level increased in 2024? 75% said yes. You're very aware of this, that for those medical practice leaders, other people, healthcare professionals, stress, burnout, they're ever present. Time management, bandwidth are tremendous issues. How in the world do you do all these different things? How do you run these different things? You're also a partner in a law firm. You're also, podcasting, doing 7 interviews in a day. How do you do it, Scott?
Well, I think what happens is the trick to everything is, and we're just having this discussion with one of the children a half hour right before we get on the phone with you, is one of the keys in all these things is if you build teams and you could do what you love doing, when you start out anything, there's the old phrase, cook, bottle washer, chief this, you're doing everything. At some point, as you grow in your career, hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully you're not doing everything. So, Jessica Cole really runs the media company today. I'm able to do the things I love doing. I get to visit with our editorial team. I get to visit with our leaders. I get to visit with people like you. I get to visit with health system leaders. I get to do my podcast, but I'm not like what Jess and her team does. They do it fantastically well, and it's hard work. And she's built a fantastic team that does a lot of that. So I get to, at one point I did all that, but it's a long time ago. And so I do a portion of what I used to do. The same thing in the law practice. A lot of the people that I developed the practice with, one of them, Amber Wolf, sits on the executive committee today. One of them, Holly Buckley, runs the healthcare practice today. So there were periods of time where I spent a period of time in my 30s and 40s, basically businesses and children and nothing else. I didn't do guys' nights out. I wasn't out golfing. I wasn't doing guy trips. I wasn't doing any of those things. I was running businesses and children. And those were the two big priorities. And, like one of the kids had sent me a TikTok about somebody regretting that they had been a doctor and spent so much of their life being a doctor. And this daughter is in med school. So I basically had to call her immediately and say, look, some of those years of my life when I was raising the kids and working hard at business, they might have been hard, but they were also the most satisfying parts of my life. So they were hard, but satisfying. Now I work hard in a lot of ways that I choose to work hard in, and it's more a portfolio of life than a couple core focuses. And so it was it was harder then, but it was simple because I was doing those things. I do think, like, as I was talking to this daughter today, she spends 35 years doing just this, just seeing patients doing this. Well, the same thing as a coal miner spending 60 hours a week in the coal mine, she's going to be burnt out. So, and the beauty of today's workforce is, and this is one of the challenges we have from health system leaders, is doctors want to work 0.3, 0.4, 0.7, 0.8, not like 130% like our father's generation did or our generation did. That they want to work a balanced life so she could raise kids, be a fantastic professional, and have a very full life. And so I think it's much different today, but the expectations are different too. So it causes stress for everybody.
Yeah.
But it's expected that she'll be able to have some level of work balance. She can't do everything at the same time, but I didn't start golfing until I was almost 50 because I didn't have time for golf and those kinds of things when I was really starting to build practice and stuff like that. And consequently, I'm not a great golfer, but this is life, this is life, but I think there's a lot to be said for there's literally in this discussion today, some of the most satisfying parts of life were the parts where we're working very hard at building things. Now I don't work nearly as hard. I work on a variety of things, but they're not, it's not like I'm building a company and if we don't meet payroll next week, I'm broke, because we had those years, and we had those years. It was satisfying. It was hard, but satisfying.
Yeah.
So
we've covered a lot of different topics today, from pizza to sports to your media and podcast empires. But I want you to leave some advice for our MGMA practice leaders. You're going to be speaking to them in Chicago in May at the MGMA Operations Conference. What advice can you give them? Because you are creating content daily for them. And so if you have an overarching theme or you want to leave them with something, what would that be?
Sure. No, that's a great question. We have a couple overarching things that I'll try and touch on very, very quickly. I think the most daunting problem is ultimately a workforce problem. And I'll talk specifically about the physician workforce. We've got 1,060,000 physicians. We only produce 18,000 a year. We've got 330 million people in our country. There's just not enough physicians. And if you want to talk about stress, it's either a health system leader trying to fill out physician positions. As a physician, it's stressful, but you always have a job right now, unless you can't control your own boundaries. But it's, that workforce challenge is a real challenge. We all know, we all see it. Our government, both Democrats and Republicans, are all over the place and not worried about solving problems. But, that is a real problem. So that's sort of one piece that we have to get focused on, or we're going to find ourselves with real trouble. We all know already that if you want to get access to the right person, you need to know somebody. And from a health equity perspective, from an access perspective, that's just a very bad spot to be in. So that's sort of one big overarching thought. The second thing I'll leave people with is, aside from the fact that you have to constantly take care of your physical and mental health, because if you don't do so, it will you can't start it at 70 and do so. And there's a billion books on this and a billion thoughts on this, but I'm a believer you better start taking care of your physical and mental health early. The other thing I would say is you have to constantly lean into things that are interesting to you. and to cultivate those things. And I would say it's okay to work hard, especially if you're not ignoring your physical and mental health and your family and your other things you have to do and the things that are very important to you. But working hard is okay. There's always a student in school that works so hard that the other people tease him. And it's okay to work hard, but it's also okay to do it in a way with some humility, in the right way. But don't be afraid to lean in and be a leader. It's okay. The world needs a lot of leaders. And so when people ask me, what's the trick to getting mentored? The mentors, the people that give advice, the people that talk to people, if you are clearly showing yourself as hungry to learn, hungry to lead, generally I find people lean into people like that because there's not enough of them. And people there's so many people that are so lost today that don't be afraid to cultivate your passions and to lean in. I mean, and obviously be empathetic and help everybody else. But there's just it's a challenging world. But I think not be afraid to lean in and to lean into your passions and cultivate them.
Love that, Scott. And it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us today.
What an honor and a privilege, Daniel. Thank you. We've been a huge follower for MGMA for my entire professional career. So to me, it's a complete pleasure. So thank you.
That is so cool. Well, that is going to do it for this episode of the MGMA Insights podcast. We have been joined by Scott Becker. And in the episode show notes, I am going to provide direct links. You probably already get his newsletters and the podcast, but I'm not going to take a chance. I'm going to put those in the episode show notes. And we're also going to put a link to the Operations Conference where Scott is going to be talking. The show is from May 30th to June 1st in Chicago. Scott, thanks again, and thanks to all of you for being podcast listeners.